And now on BBC One, See Here.
Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Behind the News, our monthly programme which goes behind the news headlines to take a look at the issues which affect us all. This month we're taking a look at two issues which have been in the news recently and which directly affect deafened and deaf people. Firstly, we'll be taking a look at the row over the government's plans for war pensions, especially compensation for veterans whose hearing loss gets worse. The second is the latest developments with digital television and the implications for deaf viewers. What's in it for us? Later, Ramon Wolf will be joining us in the studio to discuss the stories which have been making the sporting headlines this month. But over to Clark, who will tell you about the changes to the government's plans.
A few weeks ago, a report appeared in the press saying that the government planned changes in the payment of war pensions which could result in savings of as much as £50 million. It's a decision which has been described as a mean-minded attack on an elderly section of society who spent several years of their youth defending our country. In the 20th century, countless millions of servicemen and women have been killed and injured fighting for their country during wartime. And of course, we mustn't forget the civilian population who also suffered greatly as a result of war. In the past, anyone who had a disability which they were able to link back to wartime has been able to claim a war disablement pension. The largest number of these claims have come from people who have had their hearing damaged during the war.
During the war, little was known about the damage that noise could cause. But we now know that exposure to loud gunfire and explosions can be very damaging indeed to human hearing. Even a couple of explosions can cause permanent damage. Those affected have usually been eligible to claim a war disablement pension for deafness. The amount the person receives depends on the degree of hearing loss. It has proved to be a much-needed source of extra cash for thousands of people. However, recent plans by the government to cut veterans' entitlements to war pensions may well stop this particular benefit from being paid out in the future. The plans, which could save the government up to £50 million a year, have caused anger and alarm. But the Prime Minister, John Major, insists that no one currently claiming a war pension will lose out. The government says that the reasons for the changes are to simplify the administration of war pensions. Up until now, war veterans with a hearing loss of 20% or higher have been eligible for a pension. The new rules mean only those with a hearing loss of 40% or higher will qualify. They also plan to save money by stopping sending out reminders to people who haven't returned claim forms.
But the most controversial change is the idea of stopping higher disability awards for British war veterans if their hearing loss gets worse sometime after leaving the services. Some reports have suggested that these changes will affect 10,000 veterans a year who stand to lose claims that they would have won in previous years. The Prime Minister told the House of Commons that the government had no alternative but to act as they did, and that this decision was based on new independent medical evidence which said that damage to hearing received during wartime could not cause further deterioration years later. It means that pensioners in the future won't be able to blame increasing deafness on the effects of war. It will virtually wipe out war pensions for damage to hearing. Many pensioners who fought for their country have been left feeling upset and angry. Last week, Jack Ashley took up the issue in the House of Lords.
The Lord Ashley of Stoke. Would the noble minister not agree that the Minister of Defence say that no service personnel leaving with less than 20% hearing disability will get a pension, end of story, but they're ignoring the central fact that when noise-induced deafness is added to the ageing process, as it is, that's a central point, then earlier and more severe deafness disability ensues. Some people can get by with ageing deafness, but when it's added to noise-induced deafness, they're struggling and in very serious trouble. Would the Minister let us know when we can have new regulations?
My Lord, sir, the noble Lord, I think, is very confused between initial noise-induced deafness and deterioration due to age. The position is that anybody whose noise-induced deafness is 20% or above will indeed receive a pension. And there is no point in the noble Lord shaking his head in dissent, because that is true. Anybody with 20% or above will receive a pension. The issue now, currently, the matter of discussion, is the question of whether age-related deterioration has been affected by that noise-induced hearing. And the medical evidence is quite clear. The final change in medical opinion followed publications of articles by Mark Loachman and Adrian Davis in the Scientific Basis of Noise-Induced Hearing Loss in February 1996. Their findings represent the views of experts at the Medical Research Council Institution of Hearing and by audiological scientists at the Institute of Sound and Vibration Research. The position on war pension legislation is that the agency and ministers are obliged to follow medical opinion, whether that favours the war pensioner or whether it favours the government. The noble Lord, I suspect, would not expect us to do otherwise.
And with me in the studio is Jack Ashley. Jack, let me ask you, what has brought about this change to the war pension scheme by the government?
It's been brought about by a claim by the government that the medical opinion has changed radically. And so the government said, in view of this change of medical opinion, it is changing the scheme. But the medical opinion, the medical experts say that their opinion has not changed. In fact, the two medical experts quoted by Lord Mackay in the House of Lords have written him an open letter saying he was quite wrong and that medical opinion has not changed for 30 years.
So what is your main objection to the government's plans for war pensions?
Well, the main objection is that it excludes virtually all ex-service personnel who suffer noise-induced deafness. Now, I think this is preposterous because the whole point of legislation is to ensure that those who suffer noise-induced deafness should get compensation. But now that the government have changed this scheme, it simply means that virtually no one will get it. That's absolutely preposterous.
Can you put the medical debate in a nutshell for us, Jack?
Well, of course, this whole issue refers to people in the future. And the medical experts, according to the government, have changed their view. The government say that the medical experts are saying that noise-induced deafness does not aggravate age-related deafness as you get older and become more deaf. They say the first lot of deafness does not aggravate the second lot. But that's not the point. The real medical point is that the disability of deafness is made worse because you've got one lot, noise-induced deafness, and then the disability as a whole is clearly made worse if one gets a second lot due to age. And that's the point. If a person is suffering from both, then automatically the disability is the greater. That's the nub of this whole issue.
So what happens now, Jack? I understand you're going to raise the issue in the House of Lords again on Tuesday. So what are your expectations?
All we can do is keep on applying the pressure. The object is to make sure that the government, if they're not satisfied with the existing legislation, should change legislation. What I want them to do is to reappraise and review the whole situation to bring forward a common sense solution which ensures that those people who suffer noise-induced deafness in the service of the country, and if then they become deaf later on, that one way or another they should be given proper, reasonable and fair compensation as they did get before the government changed its mind.
Thank you, Jack. And of course, we'll be keeping a watchful eye on the latest developments. Carolyn.
You may remember that in the first Behind the News programme in the series, we looked at some of the exciting possibilities for television viewers with the new digital broadcasting system, which will soon be available to us here in Britain. We're promised all sorts of new services as a result of this move into digital broadcasting, and it could be with us within the next 12 months. For the broadcasters, it means more channels. For us, the viewer, it means more ways of making use of our television. For example, calling up information and even buying things using the TV remote control. We will be able to get cinema-style widescreen versions of our favourite programmes, 24-hour news channels, and a whole host of new digital channels at the flick of a switch.
The world of broadcasting is changing. The digital age has arrived. It will dramatically increase the number of services that can be delivered to British audiences. Within the next 10 years, households could have a choice of many hundreds of channels. From mainstream broadcasting to specialist online interaction, the pace of change is getting faster. More and more providers will harness the technology, leading to a quantum leap in the number of channels, from dozens to hundreds.
Most importantly of all, from our point of view in the deaf community, is the new development of side channels, which will offer extra services, including the potential for signing. In last year's Broadcasting Act, there was a stipulation by Parliament that the minimum amount of signing on the new digital terrestrial TV channels should be 5% and subtitling 50%. It was then over to the broadcasters to draw up their own recommendations about how these targets might be achieved. The Independent Television Commission, the body which regulates ITV, Channel 4 and the new Channel 5, has been consulting with many organisations and representatives of the deaf community about how best to implement the Act. See Here has copies of the ITC's draft proposals and the responses from the deaf organisations to them, and it is clear that many deaf people are concerned about some of the ITC's proposals. Under the Broadcasting Act of 1996, the minimum amounts of signing are recommended to be 5% and subtitling 50%. However, the ITC's proposals exclude all programmes other than news and factual programmes from the 5% requirement for signing. This means that only 5% of a small proportion of programmes will be signed. They also argue that subtitling is much more difficult to provide for live programmes than for pre-recorded ones. They have decided that live programmes are to be excluded from the 50% requirement for subtitling. They propose that the minimum requirements for subtitling in relation to live programming should be 25%, half of what Parliament originally suggested. Last week, Parliament discussed the ITC recommendations.
My Lords, I believe that the ITC have failed to appreciate the importance of signing to profoundly deaf people who rely on sign language, and they have exaggerated the difficulties. Now, the noble Lord spoke a moment ago about the difficulties and all the new problems and all the rest of it. Okay, new technology. But there is no basic problem with signing these programs. There is no real problem with signing. So I believe that there's great exaggeration on behalf of the ITC. What they are doing, the ITC, is they're conforming to the letter of the law, but they're denying the spirit of the law. And they will make deaf people feel cheated and incur the opposition and even the hostility of some of us in both houses of Parliament, and I hope that they will reconsider.
Faced with an onslaught like that, it's not surprising that the ITC are reconsidering their policy. But of course, it doesn't mean that we can't discuss the draft code. So we thought the best plan was to give the floor to two people who've got very strong views on the issue. Penny Beskisser from the Deaf Broadcasting Council, and a man who's having a very busy week both in Parliament and in the Behind the News studio, Jack Ashley. I'd like to ask you, what's the DBC's reaction to the ITC proposal?
When the DBC received the draft, we had a look through it and we were outraged. A lot of things need clarification. For example, one part talks about exclusions of particular programmes. This reduces the number of programmes that would be included in the percentage. For example, live subtitling of the news and sports programmes. So I feel that we're still at a disadvantage. We've been trying to lobby for equality, but we're just pushed to one side and are still at a disadvantage. So I disagree with that.
I understand that the ITC plans to scrap the 50% minimum amount of subtitling for live programmes and reduce it to just 25%, as they say that subtitling of live programmes is extremely difficult. But as someone who presumably watches live subtitles, like on the recent programme about the royal family, what's your view on this?
It seems ludicrous, because having achieved live subtitles, we can't go backwards. We need to keep on making progress. Live programmes should not make up the part of the percentage that is exempt, because that means that deaf people will lose out. They should be included because of their value to the viewers at home. For example, with the This Morning programme, viewers can sit at home and watch what's going on right now. You just can't beat the value of feeling part of what's going on at the exact moment. It's not the same having to wait for the programme to be subtitled and watching it afterwards. They're not giving us anything new. That's just old news.
What's the DBC's vision for deaf people where television programmes are concerned? What sorts of things do they want for us?
The DBC simply wants all television to be accessible to deaf people. We pay the full television licence and simply want equal access to television, the same as hearing people get. That's the crux of our argument with the ITC.
If I can turn to you now, Jack. You've seen the ITC proposals on signing and subtitles, which do not follow the original proposals laid down by Parliament, and which have angered deaf people. What's your reaction?
Well, I'm appalled at the proposals because the draft proposals say that there should be 5% of only factual programmes and news programmes, and everything else should be excluded. Now, this is preposterous because it is not what Parliament intended. Parliament said 5%. Admittedly, they said there can be some exclusions, no doubt thinking of music or something of that kind. But for the ITC to exclude all programmes except news and factual programmes is absolutely preposterous. And I think it's really insulting to deaf people. I'm hoping ITC will change their minds.
It seems that the ITC are reluctant to follow Parliament's original proposals. Why is that?
The ITC are interpreting the will of Parliament in entirely the wrong way. It is a very bad judgment, and the ITC will have to think again, because it's quite clear from what the Secretary of State said on the report stage of the bill in the House of Commons, that she wanted, the government wanted, and Parliament wanted these exclusions to be very tiny, and instead the ITC have made the programmes to be signed very tiny, so they've got it back to front, and they better make it front to front when they publish their substantive proposals. Otherwise, all hell will be let loose.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Penny. Clearly, the ITC proposals have met with a considerable degree of opposition. The final words in the debate in the House of Lords were, "I do not believe that the ITC will not respond to the whole issue in an entirely responsible manner." We've been advised that the ITC may very well publish a revised code shortly. When they do, we will cover the story in See Here. Meanwhile, it's equally clear that the BBC will also have to publish its policy. The BBC is also bound by the Broadcasting Act. In fact, it appears that the BBC may be the first terrestrial digital broadcaster in Britain. At the moment, there's no agreed BBC policy on the matter, but as the largest provider of signed TV programmes in Britain, if not the world, the BBC has a positive approach to the challenges laid down by the Act. The huge opportunities offered by new technology are being carefully and enthusiastically considered. It's important to remember that digital transmission may not start for at least another year, and that to receive the transmissions, we will have to buy new television equipment. So there's still time for both the ITC and the BBC to refine their policies. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts on the issue, do let us know. And if you're hooked up to the internet, have a look at our webpage where you may be able to watch a signed extract of the breakfast news. To what extent does the future of signing rest with the internet? Let us know. Clark, over to you.
Yep, the next thing then will be Glasgow Rangers on the internet. Now, it's not very often that a sports story knocks everything else off the front pages of our newspapers and is the main story on every television and radio news programme. But Kevin Keegan was so popular in the northeast of England that people would name their dogs Kevin after him, and in fact even their children. So when he resigned as manager of Newcastle United, it caused pandemonium, not only in the city of Newcastle, but throughout the sporting world, with everybody wanting to know just what had gone on. So what's behind the resignation of one of the most popular managers ever?
Kevin Keegan.
When Kevin Keegan came to manage Newcastle in 1992, the future of the club, both on and off the pitch, looked rosy. Backed by a wealthy chairman, he had lots of money to spend, and the team was supported by some of the most loyal fans in the country. But the pressures on Keegan to succeed have been enormous, and after 5 years with no major trophies to show for all his efforts, strain was beginning to tell. It's hardly surprising he was so stressed. He persuaded Newcastle's chairman, Sir John Hall, to part with £60 million, the biggest part of which was spent capturing the signature of Alan Shearer from Blackburn Rovers. But for all the money spent on players, the major prize of the Premier League title looked as if it was slipping away from him again. The stresses on modern managers are greater than ever before. Large amounts of money are pouring into the game from television deals, from sales of shirts, and from joining the stock exchange. Newcastle are the latest football club to do this. The pressure to succeed is sometimes overwhelming, and several managers have surrendered to this pressure. Kevin Keegan is the latest in a growing number of stressed-out managers who have opted for an easier life outside football. He won't be the last. Now that Kenny Dalglish has taken over as manager of Newcastle, it'll be interesting to see if they can win the Premier League title. He's the most successful manager in English football in recent times. If Newcastle succeed, then Dalglish will be the first manager to win the title with 3 different clubs. That would be some feat. But with football having become a multi-billion-pound sport, the pressures on managers to succeed are enormous. With me in the studio to discuss the changes at Newcastle and some of the other sporting headlines is Ramon Wolf.
Hi.
Let me ask you, Ramon, with Kevin Keegan leaving the club due to pressure and other managers saying the same, is it really the result of the pressures of the job?
Well, recently there's been a lot of media interest about the pressures of football management. It started with the resignation of Steve Coppell from Man City. Since then, there's been a succession of managerial resignations. At present, Harry Redknapp of West Ham is under intense pressure. I'm not sure what kind of intense pressure they're under. Some people feel that the pressure comes from being responsible for millions of pounds worth of transfer deals. But I think it's more to do with the very high expectations of the fans. Other people dismiss that as not being real pressure, citing the example of hospital workers. They're under real pressure because of the long hours they work, because they're always on call. They may have to rush out in the middle of the night. That's what a lot of people would call real pressure. That's what the debate's about.
Do you think that the pressure they've talked about comes from fans expecting too much, or is it the pressure to buy new players, or does it come from above, from the board of directors?
In the past, the true spirit of football was that you'd go to a match and cheer on your team. Nowadays, it's all about buying foreign players. It's more like a business. It's all money, money, money. Now that Kenny Dalglish has taken over at Newcastle, he'll immediately tackle a big problem at the club. They have a £44 million deficit. They're trying to clear that deficit by floating Newcastle on the stock exchange, which means that if people want to buy shares, they'll need about £500. How many people in Newcastle can afford that kind of money?
Let me ask you, Ramon, supposing a fan decides they want to invest money in their favourite club, then they've got shares in that club. Obviously they want them to do well. Surely there's an extra pressure there. They don't want to lose their money. That must contribute to the pressure that exists in the game, surely.
Well, at a football match, you have the manager there anxious for his team to win, and you have the fans watching excitedly from the terraces or at home on TV. It's a nail-biting time. Money's no object, just as long as they have the strip. The England strip's just been changed. Before, it was like this. Now it's like that. Families brought the strip for their children at Christmas time, and just 18 days later, they change it. It was introduced by Alan Shearer, the captain of England. Children looked at the strip and saw it was out of date, so they no longer want it. They want the new one. They're so fashion conscious nowadays. That's the effect it's had.
It seems that first of all they're under pressure to win, then there's the pressure to sell the merchandise for the club, then there's the pressure to try and attract sponsorship. Whatever happened to the fun element of the game?
Well, nowadays, football's viewed in a different way. I mean, talking of the England strip, I've read in the press about a new regulation. You know, we've got a law which says that if you sell food, for example, it must have a best before date on it. Maybe they should have a similar label saying that the England strip only has a shelf life of 2 years.
Well, let me ask you then, Ramon, do you think that deaf sports should be run in the same way, with selling shares in the teams, merchandising?
It's interesting listening to you two talk about the changes in strips. I just thank God that I've no sons, only daughters. It saves me money.
Ah, but daughters can be just as bad.
Yeah, it's never ending. Anyway, that's the end of today's programme. Behind the News will be back next month, but for now, goodbye.
This morning's See Here has another showing at midday on Tuesday on BBC.